A very warm welcome to our gratifyingly global audience for another IISS Japan Chair Program webinar. A special thanks to those in Asia who are staying up late to be on the session, and to those on the East Coast of the US, of course, who are getting up early to be with us today. I'm Robert Ward, the IISS Japan Chair and Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy at the Institute. With my IISS colleague, Mariko Togashi, Fellow for Japanese Security and Defense Policy, we will be looking after you for today's webinar. The topic of today's discussion, Japan and the G7, is Japan's presidency this year of the G7. Tokyo last held the position in 2016, when, of course, the world looked very different indeed from how it does today. This year's G7 presidency, of course, comes at a period of high global geopolitical tension. Russia's invasion of Ukraine nearly a year ago, of course, extreme volatility in global commodity prices and rising concerns over the stability of the Taiwan Strait and the Indo-Pacific more broadly have all aggravated global geopolitical fault lines. The Japanese G7 presidency thus has great global importance, particularly, of course, as Japan is the only Asian member of the G7. For this webinar, the IISS Japan Chair Program is delighted to host experts from inside and outside Japan to discuss Tokyo's likely priorities, as well as those of its partners for the G7 Hiroshima Summit in May. We will consider issues ranging from the sustainability of G7 sanctions against Russia to energy and economic security, Japan's response, the conditions that enabled rapid coordination with Western countries of sanctions and more, and their reactions and future implications, and the way in which the G7 can support security in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. We have a very distinguished panel of experts for you, who I will introduce in 1 second after my colleague Mariko has given you some information about logistics. Over to you, Mariko.
Hello, my name is Mariko Togashi. Just to frame the format of today's webinar, after introducing the speakers, they will each offer a brief 5-minute presentation, and then we will begin a 20-minute discussion followed by a 15-minute Q&A session. We will be using a Zoom Q&A function that can be found at the bottom of your screens, and you are very welcome to type in your questions anytime. Please state your affiliation and your name when writing in your question. Thank you. Back to you, Robert.
Thank you, Mariko. So introducing the speakers in order of that they will speak in. The first is Shikata Noriyuki, who is calling from Tokyo today with a wonderful backdrop of Hiroshima on his screen. Shikata-san is a Cabinet Secretary for Public Affairs under Prime Minister Kishida Fumio. Most recently, he was Assistant Minister, Director General for the Economic Affairs Bureau at Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Previously, Shikata-san also served as Deputy Chief of Mission of the Embassy of Japan in China from 2017 to 2019, Deputy Director General for the Asian and Oceanian Affairs Bureau at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Political Minister for the Embassy of Japan in London from 2012 to 14, and Director of Global Communications at the Prime Minister's Office from 2010 to 2012. Shikata-san also has a cast iron constitution. During Prime Minister Kishida's tour of the G7 in January, he told us that he had breakfast in Paris, lunch in Rome, and dinner in London. So a reminder of the fortitude that diplomacy also requires of its participants. Our second distinguished speaker is Dr. Katada Saori, who is Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Southern California. And she was also Vice President of the International Studies Association from 2021 to 22. Saori Sensei has authored a number of books, including most recently, and I recommend this one very highly, having read it myself, Japan's New Regional Reality, Geoeconomic Strategy in the Asia Pacific, which was published by Columbia University Press in July 2020. Before joining USC, Saori Sensei also served as a researcher at the World Bank in Washington, D.C., and an international program officer at the UNDP in Mexico City. Saori is currently on sabbatical leave at Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University, where she is dialing in from Beppu in southern Japan, one of Japan's onsen hot spring hotspots. So a warm welcome to you, Saori, as well from Japan. Our third speaker is Charles Clover. Charles is the former Beijing correspondent at the Financial Times, who is currently on secondment to Nikkei Asia and also in Tokyo. Charles was formerly Moscow bureau chief for the FT and is the author of Black Wind, White Snow, The Rise of Russia's New Nationalism, which traces the origins, evolution, and ideas of Eurasianism. Charles was the 2011 British Press Awards Foreign Reporter of the Year and won a 2011 Martha Gellhorn Special Award for Journalism for his work on Russian nationalism. Charles also received an RIA Novosti Press Award in 2014. And our fourth speaker is Dr. Sheila Smith, who is John E. Merrow Senior Fellow for Asia Pacific Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Sheila is one of the world's leading authorities on Japanese politics and foreign policy, as I'm sure many of you will already know, and is the author of two very fine books on Japan. One is Japan Rearmed, the Politics of Military Power, and then Intimate Rivals, Japanese Domestic Politics and a Rising China. Sheila is also the author of CFR Interactive Guide on Constitutional Change in Japan. So thanks everybody very much for joining us today, and thanks again to our audience for joining us. And without more ado, I'd like to ask Shikata-san to give us 5 minutes on your main points, please. Over to you, Shikata-san.
Well, thank you, Robert. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from Tokyo, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor to have the opportunity to take part in this webinar today. My presentation will be focused on Japan's role at the G7 Summit, and it will be divided into two main pillars. First, I will talk about global issues to be discussed at the G7, and secondly, I'll touch on security issues. On global issues, this year in May, Japan is chairing the G7 Summit in Hiroshima, and Prime Minister Kishida has been proactively engaged with other G7 members to ensure its success. In January, as Robert mentioned, he visited France, Italy, the UK, Canada, and the US in 1 week, where he exchanged views on the G7 with the leaders of these countries. Prime Minister Kishida hopes that the G7 summit will be a forum for discussion where leaders can unite in their efforts to uphold a free and open international order based on the rule of law, and to oppose any attempts to unilaterally change the status quo by force anywhere in the world. The summit will be a vital opportunity to show a commitment to strengthening sanctions on Russia over its invasion of Ukraine, as well as further promoting a strong support for Ukraine. We believe that security in Europe and the Indo-Pacific are inseparable. And as Prime Minister Kishida repeatedly said, today's Ukraine could be tomorrow's Asia. Japan has been proactively promoting the free and open Indo-Pacific, FOIP, and is seeking to collaborate more closely with other G7 countries on furthering FOIP. At the G7 summit, Prime Minister Kishida will also address other global issues, including the energy and food security crisis caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and other issues like climate change, global health, as well as trade and investment issues, which has much to do with economic security issues. In order for the international community as a whole to cooperate in their response to these challenges, the G7 will unite and strengthen its engagement with the so-called Global South. Other important issues to be discussed include the North Korean situation, sustainable development in Africa, and such issues as the UN reform. The summit will be held in Hiroshima, the only city in the in the world, along with Nagasaki, to have suffered an atomic bombing. Prime Minister Kishida will be reinforcing the importance of working towards a world without nuclear weapons. Number two is Japan's defense and national security strategy. Japan faces an extremely severe and complex security situations. There are three reasons for this. Number one, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is witnessing an aggression that was no longer expected to occur after World War II. Japan is, as you know, adjacent to Russia, with which it has a territorial dispute. Number two, North Korea launched about 60 ballistic missiles last year alone. This is about 2.54 times more than in 2019, the highest during the Abe administration. As you have heard last weekend, North Korea launched an ICBM-class missile, which landed within Japan's EEZ, about 200 kilometers westward of Japan's main island. Moreover, the nature of these missiles has become much more threatening. For instance, missiles now have irregular trajectories that are difficult to defend, and they are developing new ICBMs, and there are indications that they may be preparing for a nuclear test. Number three, last summer, just take an example, China launched 5 ballistic missiles inside Japan's EEZ for the first time. Given these situations, we conducted a highly realistic simulation to see whether we could defend our country if the threat became a reality. As a result, we concluded that the current situation was inadequate, so we revised 3 key security documents, including the national security strategy, in order to strengthen Japan's defense capabilities. Prime Minister Kishida has confirmed that he will promote security cooperation with other G7 leaders who share universal values through joint military exercises and development and sharing of military assets, including next generation combat aircraft. We will be collaborating with the UK and Italy on one specific project. In addition, during his recent visit and meeting with the G7 countries, Prime Minister Kishida shared with their leaders the view that unilateral change to the status quo by force in the East China Sea and South China Sea will never be tolerated, and reiterated the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. So I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kata-san. Useful reminder to our listeners, of course, that Japan's is in a very, as you said, severe and complex security environment. And thank you for reminding us that Japan and Russia are neighbors, actually. And of course, North Korea and China have both fired missiles in Japan's direction. So lots to think about there. Thank you, Kata-san. Without more ado, Saori-sensei, over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very honor to be invited to in the company of wonderful scholars and policymakers, Nori, Charles, and Sheila. And thank you for inviting me, Mariko, and Robert. So, obviously, Robert talked about how important this G7 is and how critical the Japanese leadership in this context. And I would like to talk about, especially focusing on the economic landscape. So this is a critically important time for the world when it comes to the kind of maintaining the prosperous and stable global economy. Obviously, this is a way to minimize the division and disruption, which is already seen in various ways through the COVID crisis, the war on Ukraine, and various other disruptions of supply chains, as well as food and energy insecurity and accumulating debt among the many countries and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, obviously avoiding abuse of economic interdependence, as already mentioned by Shikata-san, economic coercion and so on has become a very crucial concern. And Japan, secondly, in this context, Japan is experiencing a high expectation partly because Japan has had a pretty strong track record in taking leadership in the area of economic governance in the past. And I will mention a bit on the rulemaking and rule-based, maintaining rule-based order. But at the past G7 in IISS in 2016, as well as the G20 in Osaka Summit in 2019, there have been quite a significant achievement. So everybody's looking at Japan with a high expectation. And finally, in terms of that importance, this is the first one of the three major summitary. G7 is one, obviously, and then next one coming in India, G20, and then APEC will be hosted by the United States. So setting the tone is crucial for Japan. So in that context, what are the likely priorities? And there are many, many, many priorities, so we really probably don't have time to list all of them. But focusing just on the economic side, I would like to put these priorities in three clusters. So the first cluster is to obviously preserve and energize free and open rule-based international economic orders, again, focusing on the economy. And this is to address the danger of deglobalization and a blocking of the economies. The achievement on this front by the Japanese government's leadership has been quite significant, as I mentioned, not only what they have achieved in kind of making consensus in the areas of quality infrastructure investment and various others, but also making the CPTPP, the kind of aftermath of the TPP with the United States departure, saving it and making sure this becomes a key component of maintaining liberal international economic order. So in that context, other areas such as the digital economy, so which is kind of focusing on the e-economy, free data transfer, source code protection, so on and so forth, a very crucial part of what this the G7 could achieve, and also utilizing the recently promoted IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum. Many of the rule making and rule-based order will be something that will be the focus of the G7 agenda. So this is the area that Japan has always played an important role, and it continues to be a very important part of the global economy. The second component is its relationship with the global South, and adding inclusive into the open and free Indo-Pacific, or the open free international economic order. So this has been global South has increased importance, not only because of the Ukraine and the UN vote and things like that, but also in order to maintain the peaceful, dynamic and economic relationship where the center of gravity is now shifted towards emerging and developing economies. Japan can play a major role in bridging and kind of being the interlocutor between the global South and the G7. Japan has already had a significant, I think, inherent advantage of a country which went through a rapid economic growth and various other transformations from 150 years forward, from Meiji Restoration forward. While Japan, and in addition, Japan is also a very trusted member among especially the Indo-Pacific, but beyond, where ASEAN basically talks about Japan as the most trusted member of the region, and that's a very strong advantage. And finally, in addition to those advantages, Japan is the one that can actually persuade the global South to respect and uphold the rule-based order because of its experience and so on. So instead of imposing the values, but Japan can probably persuade it much more effectively. So in many ways, this is the kind of ways in which inclusive and shared growth could be achieved among the many members of the global community going beyond G7, and that's a very important role that Japan can play. And finally, the third and probably most difficult task is balancing economic security and economic growth. So obviously these days, economic security has become very much of importance. The weaponization, coercion, and security implication of economic exchanges have been heightened in the recent past. And this is really a crucial point. It is easy to think about what not to do or what should we avoid. We should avoid, and Japan should promote the avoidance of the economic security becoming another protectionist policy, where industrial policies and various of the various protection of that nature is becoming a zero-sum game. That's that's clear to everyone, and that has to be significantly promoted. Meanwhile, how could economic security can be used along with the kind of prospect of economic growth is much harder. But increasing autonomy and increasing diversity, both in terms of production and the kind of the resource base and so on, would be a key component. And including various members beyond the countries that these supplies are at this point concentrated would be one way to think about this. The other is obviously rule-based order, which I've already mentioned. And finally, maybe having a selective kind of coalition of selective items which are sometimes like things like the critical emerging technology or various security related items should kind of go through various kind of rethinking, especially things like friendshoring and stuff could be utilized in order to protect the economic security along with growth. But this is really a balancing act at this point, and G7 needs to get together to think of this very, very carefully. So to conclude, the leadership in this area of the economic area is vital. And Japan has, or Japanese government has, in this national security strategy that they announced just a couple of months ago, talked about use of comprehensive national power. And Japan already has a significant leadership in this area, and it should be enhanced through this leadership in G7. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Saudi. And your third point about balancing economic security and growth was music to my ears. And I'm sure we will be talking about that in the discussion, how to avoid protectionism. But a very important point you made about emphasizing Japan's strong track record in taking leadership in economic governance. That's obviously will be important for the G7 and Japan's ability to persuade rather than impose with regard to upholding the rules-based order. So thank you for that, Saudi. And now, Charles, with your in this group, your unique perspectives with one Russia hat on and one China hat on. So over to you, please.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Robert. And it's a great honor to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. As you said, I haven't spent a lot of time in Japan, but I've spent a fair bit of time in Northeast Asia, and I tend to see the situation here through the prism of Russia and China, two countries where I've most recently been based. Northeast Asia, I think, is the region of the world that's most probably most exposed to this new spirit of realpolitik that we see sort of sweeping through the world, this kind of Bismarckian 19th century European style geopolitics of strength and power and alliances and spheres of influence, and it's most apparent here, and particularly in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think it's quite clear that the lesson of that that's been ingested everywhere is that power unfortunately matters more now than it did, and alliances matter more now than they did. Defense budgets matter more now than they did. Spheres of influence and things like that, and this is something that the countries of this region, including Japan, have all, they all have to be very smart about this. And you see the same trends happening throughout the region. Defense budgets are going up, including in Japan. there's a new national security strategy that mentions, I'm not an expert on this, but talks about sort of counter-strike capabilities, for instance. And Japan is now really in lockstep with the rest of the G7 in terms of sanctions on Russia, which is actually a bit of a change compared to 2014 when Russia took Crimea. And also, it's a very good year, I might add, to be reminding the world of the dangers of nuclear war. This is a particularly opportune message to be reminding everybody, and Japan has a unique and tragic experience of that. So I think Japan faces an alliance of China and Russia. It's possibly the country that's most exposed to that alliance. I think Japan spent a fair amount of time under Prime Minister Abe trying to keep that alliance from happening. I think some of the diplomacy with Russia was clearly focused on regaining the northern territories, but also in kind of trying to drive a wedge between Russia and China. And that obviously didn't succeed. Now, if the importance of the war, however, and I can talk a bit about the Russia-China alliance a little later, I think, because that is, I think, the most important manifestation of this new kind of spirit of realpolitik that we see. There's no greater, expression of this idea of the enemy of my enemy is my friend than the Russia-China alliance. But the Russian invasion of Ukraine is definitely an attempt, as Prime Minister Kishida said, you would not tolerate the changing of the status quo through force, and this is definitely an attempt to do that. And if Russia does do that, if it manages to win in Ukraine, or at least not lose, this will be a real crisis for the United States and for the liberal order and the alliances that are kind of constructed that are the basis for this liberal order. And I think the thing that makes it a real crisis is this follows a debacle in Afghanistan. I think I would myself look at what happened in Afghanistan as a sort of a precursor to what's happening in Ukraine, as a sort of a crisis of US commitment and credibility. I don't think it's a coincidence that after the US left Afghanistan, it was one year after the US left Afghanistan, Russia decided that the US order in the world was vulnerable to a challenge. And they are a Russian victory in Ukraine would raise clear questions about whether or not the US was really committed to allies and really committed to this order. Everybody would obviously start making side bets, and I think the alliance, the system of alliances would collapse. Now, the good news is that this isn't happening at the moment. Ukraine is winning. They seem to be winning, and Russia seems to be losing. I'm a bit worried, simply because, again, I keep coming back to Afghanistan. This is another country that I was based in less recently than Russia and China. Russia, like the Taliban, is going, even if they lose, they are still going to be there if the US gets tired and leaves. And that's basically what happened to the Taliban. They were defeated militarily, but they won politically. And I'm worried that Russia would manage to pull off some sort of political victory in in Ukraine simply by virtue of the fact that they were still there when the US got tired and left. And so it's very important that this not be allowed to happen. And I think it's up to all of America's allies in the G7 and the West, and including Japan, to be in lockstep with these sanctions, and for Japan to stay united with the U.S. And I think that that's more or less happening. I'm quite I'm optimistic seeing the politics of the G7, and I'm optimistic about this. So but I would say that as Prime Minister Kishida has said previously, I'm paraphrasing, but the politics of Europe are going to be, before too long, the politics of Asia, if they're allowed to, if the wrong lessons get learned. And so it's very important that Ukraine not simply be treated as a European war, a European crisis, but as a worldwide crisis. And so I think that this is something that's a lesson, and it's definitely something that Japan's support for this is absolutely crucial. That it not allowed to be simply kind of seen as a European problem, and then Japan's support allows this crisis to be seen as a global one. So that's important. Anyway, I think I'll stop there. But
thank you, Charles, for that sort of tour of Japan's important neighbors. Thank you again for reminding us that the Prime Minister Kishida linked European and Asian security, East Asia, Ukraine today, East Asia tomorrow. That's quite an important sort of strategic point that was made there. I also thought your point about alliances mattering now more than they did perhaps before, or more than they seemed to matter before, and your point about how Russia's invasion of Ukraine has catalyzed changes in Japan as well, particularly on the defense side, which I'm sure that Sheila is dying to address. So thank you, Charles, and over to you, Sheila.
Thank you, Robert and Mariko. I'm delighted to be with you all, and it's lovely to see friends and colleagues on the screen. I'm just going to, in the interest of time too, I'm going to be really brief, and 3 points I wanted to make, Robert. We often think of Japan in terms of continuity, and the context for Japanese foreign policy choices is often a continuous story of Japan's post-war identity. And I just wanted to raise some of those, but also to sort of show the deflection of what's changing and why that's so important. The first and the obvious one, especially as we look at the beautiful picture behind Nori, is that this G7 meeting will be held in Hiroshima, one of the sites of the 2 sites of atomic bombing. It highlights something that's very personally important to Prime Minister Kishida, who is of course from Hiroshima, but also for Japan. And Japan in the post-war period has not only been the site of atomic bombings, but has been a country that has actively chosen not to pursue nuclear weapons. It is a non-nuclear state by choice. And I think one of the aspects of Japanese post-war international diplomacy has been to remind the world of the costs of the use of nuclear weapons. And I think mitigating the threat of this today is ever more important than it's been in the past. So I think what Prime Minister Kishida will do in Hiroshima is to reinvigorate this longer-term project of reminding the world the importance of the moral threshold, not just the military threshold, but the moral threshold that a choice of the use of nuclear weapons carries. And I think that's a very important piece of this G7. Russia's threat and use of nuclear coercion, I think, is something that leads us down a path that no one wants to go, but it's also a path that's very hard to confront. And so it's not only hard for NATO to confront, but I think Japan reminds us also that the non-nuclear states of Asia, the Indo-Pacific, are watching this very, very closely. The second piece of continuity and also of renewed interest for me is just how important, and other speakers have emphasized this, but just how important Japan's role is in the multilateral institutions that were built in the post-war period. Saudi did an extensive focus on the economic institutions and Japan's global role. But what you're seeing here is Japan emerging from an advocate for free and open values for the Indo-Pacific to actually being one of the clearest voices in calling for a free and open international order. And it's this clarion call of these are the values, these are the institutions that we believe in, these are the institutions, in fact, that supported Japan's post-war recovery that Japan is so deeply engaged with. One of those institutions is the UN. And today we see the UN Security Council in a little bit of crisis over the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Of course, Russia's role on the UN Security Council makes it difficult, but so too does the alliance that Charles talked about. The Russian-China alliance also makes it difficult for us to see how the UN Security Council will emerge from the current moment of aggression by Russia. Japan is a non-permanent member of the Security Council at the moment, a very important place for that Japanese voice and advocacy. The other piece, of course, is the G7 itself has become, if not a substitute for the Security Council, but a platform in which the values that the United Nations represents in the post-war period, a platform that continues to echo and to outline those values in a very forceful way, both with sanctions and with aid to the victim of the aggression, Ukraine. So I think this is a very important moment for Japan. It's consistent with its past diplomacy, but Japan has emerged as a fairly leading voice in reminding us of just how much these institutions have mattered to both prosperity, as Saudi pointed out, but also to peace. So there, I think it's very important. One little aspect too, and I think this is dovetails on Charles's point about the alliances, is it's not just the global institutions, but Japan becoming a fairly active link between the US and its alliances. I think very quietly watching Japan in NATO, linking Indo-Pacific security to NATO, as Charles noted, I think has been very important, a very important piece of that diplomacy. So not just the words, but also the deeds. So let me conclude here with a last point, and it carries over from what Charles was noting. I watched Prime Minister Kishida's G7 tour in January with great interest for all the reasons that have been outlined here. Obviously, he's coordinating with partners in Europe, in Canada, in the United States, but also he took a moment in each of those European capitals to talk about defense cooperation, to talk about longer-term security goals and their interests, European interests in the Indo-Pacific as well. So I thought that was an interesting subtext, if you will, to the far more hearty Japan-European connection. The diplomatic piece, I think, is always where Japan has had heft. But as both Nori and Charles noted, the new 3 strategic documents that emerged in December, the commitment of Japan to 2% of GDP investment in its military capabilities, as well as the counterstrike, the idea that Japan will not just sit back passively, but will now incorporate strike capability in its own arsenal, I think sends also a very clear signal that this is not just talk. This is Japan really stepping up strategically to meet the challenge of today in Northeast Asia. Coalition building has been such an active part of Japanese diplomacy since, obviously Prime Minister Abe's articulation of the free and open Indo-Pacific, and Prime Minister Kishida has continued that role in a very strong way in a global context. So I see this spring's G7 also as being a very critical moment for our collective response to the Russian aggression in Kyiv. We're all watching, President Biden was just there. We're all watching Ukraine prepare for what we anticipate to be a fairly robust Russian spring offensive. Polling in Japan, there's been a couple of new polls that have come out, one by Nikkei, one by the Yomiuri, that has asked the Japanese people about Japan's role in supporting the Ukraine, and there have been a majority of Japanese have supported their government and Prime Minister Kishida's effort to play a role there. I think Japan has just announced $5.5 has a new package of aid to Ukraine. Nobody knows the numbers better than I, but I think it's a fairly significant 5 billion plus package of assistance. And I think it's going to be a very strong signal that Japan is continuing to meet the need of Ukraine. So I will end with a little bit more positive note than Charles on the alliances. I am heartened to watch the Biden administration restore American interest in its alliances. So our domestic politics are something to keep an eye on in the couple of years ahead. But I think they have done a very strong job in supporting not only Japan's willingness to step up militarily in the region, but to play this role. And I think the president was very happy to see Prime Minister Kishida in January take such a forward-leaning stance on Japan's role in the G7. So I think the US-Japan relationship is on strong ground. We will wait and see what the American people decide over the long term. And I think this spring will be a very important moment for American public opinion as well. So let me stop there. It's a very quick, rapid fire, but let me stop there in the interest of time.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sheila. Some superb points there. Your point about Japan being an active link between the US and its allies as well, so building on what Saori said a few moments ago. You talked about multinational organizations, and I've certainly got lots of questions about how Japan, having used that multinational organizations so intensively, given their weakness at the moment, what that means for how Japan interacts globally as well. So perhaps if we have time, we can talk about that. And then your fantastic point about the non-nuclear states of the Indo-Pacific watching this very carefully, this particularly this summit, and what the Prime Minister is able to achieve on nuclear proliferation issues. So lots to digest from that rich stew of thoughts from everybody. We've got some questions coming in, so I want to leave some time for our obviously engaged audience to be able to ask some questions. Maniko and I have a couple of questions that we want to just spire off to start with, and if please everybody feel free to chip in. First question to Shikada-san, and Saori actually mentioned this as well. This is a really important theme of the Global South, the so-called Global South in the summit. Can we put some meat on the bones of this concept? Clearly, we talked a lot about Japan being a bridge, a link, but what can Japan do to really get this engagement going? Because the Global South, these countries, very varied, lots of different interests, and obviously they don't want to choose either. So what do you think Japan can do concretely to get this engagement going properly?
Well, thank you very much. I mentioned at the outset the importance of the Indo-Pacific, and many of the countries in the region belong to Global South. And of course, we will be hosting G7 Summit, but G7 cannot represent the entire world. And in order to, for example, implement sanctions against Russia, we need more countries from emerging economies to come on board. So it is really critical that we would be inclusive in our approach, and the free and open Indo-Pacific represent this inclusiveness. And there are issues that we need to address in the context of G7 summit, such as climate and energy issues or food issues. There are crises taking place in the Global South or global health. So unless we address those issues, many of the countries in the Global South may not be able to support our views. So it is critically important that G7 countries would also reach out to those countries and to have more countries coming on board. At the end of the day, as I mentioned, or as Prime Minister Kishida mentioned, what we are seeing in Ukraine could happen in other parts of the world. And if we let them behave like that, this will be detrimental to the international order, and other countries, including many of the Global South, could suffer. So we need to address, those real problems, including energy issues, food crisis that are facing many parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Saori, I saw you nodding there. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I agree with Shikata-san, but if I may add a little bit that, when it comes to rulemaking and things like that, economic growth is still very important for many of these the countries in the global south, economies in the global south. And, the rules of the rules-based order, these rules has to be to serve all. So that incorporating their views in terms of how to shape, form and shape many of these rules will be very critical, important. One of the issues that I would always look into as a scholar is to look into the infrastructure development, where quality is very important. At this point, it seems to me another role that Japan can play in this in relation to global south is actually in relation to China. I think when it comes to infrastructure, that's just an example, but now China is learning from the kind of a very difficult experience of the Belt and Road Initiative, with the debt sustainability, all these things, criticism being targeted at them. So in some ways, there are opportunities for China to kind of converge into more the quality infrastructure kind of a provider, and also cooperate in a third country with Japan and various other Western nations with higher quality preference. And also, but at the same time, Japan can be an alternative to kind of a China's push in terms of these instruments. So, in some ways, there are various ways that Japan can concretely engage with the global south, and hope that will be one of the major pillar of the G7 leadership.
Thank you. A question for Sheila. I think you mentioned it, and I think one or two others mentioned as well. These historic 3 new strategic documents that came out last year. I mean, so much to digest in those with things that are about to change. But basically, a historic break with Japan's post-war security posture. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on how these documents and the national security strategy in particular might impact Japan's role in the G7 potentially, or perhaps beyond, if you have any thoughts on that.
Sure, Robert. I think, first of all, the 2% of GDP aspiration, the goal that Japan has set for itself, was made very much with NATO's collective security, the idea of NATO goals in mind. So I think here you're seeing a kind of fine tuning in a way of Japan's reference points for an ally of the United States. I think from Washington's point of view, of course, this is a very welcome engagement by Japan on the military front, and by many think it's long overdue, but it really puts Japan then not just as a country that's advocating diplomatically, but a country that's willing also to dedicate resources to the task. I think the impact on the G7 is going to be interesting, largely because now you see this connection with Europe in terms of military awareness and the ability to develop these new partnerships. I don't think it has a direct context in terms of the military side of things. What we often emphasize when we look at these 3 documents is the military side, because it was so striking. But the national security strategy itself, and I'm sure Robert and Mariko, you both would agree, is it's a fairly whole of government comprehensive look at Japanese national power, how it is used for Japan's own strategy. So it starts with diplomacy. If you read it, it's an investment in a lot of different levers of statecraft, is the word I like to use. But and I think this is what we're seeing on display at the G7. So I think that the national strategy has plenty of room for Japan to not only bring its military power to bear, but its economic and diplomatic power as well.
Because there was an important economic security component in the national security strategy. So
exactly.
Yeah.
And coordinating that with Europe is going to be just as important as coordinating with the United States, as Saudi pointed out, to avoid, the turn to protectionism or competitive dynamic that we would all automatically think of. So I think this is another coordinating kind of moment for Japan.
Mariko, you had a question.
Yes, thank you, Robert. So Charles, I wanted to ask, about a little bit more about the Japan and G7 country space. So Charles, you spoke about the China-Russia relationship and especially the Putin-Xi personal relationship, which have been keenly observed since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. How do you think this relationship will evolve as Russia is increasingly isolated by the international community? And is there any potential scenarios where Beijing puts its diplomatic status or economy at risk to aid or defend Russia's interests or its partner status?
That's a great question, Mariko. I mean, whether Beijing is, because Beijing has not yet made clear that it will risk anything or sacrifice anything or bear any costs for this relationship. I mean, China has played a very kind of deniable role. The relationship is growing, but it's being very asymmetric. China is growing and Russia is growing more dependent on China. I think the reason that China is doing the bare minimum is because it can get away with it. I mean, there has been a news report yesterday. I mean, Secretary of State Blinken said yesterday that they have credible information that China is considering lethal aid to Russia, which would transform the alliance immeasurably and make, this would be a whole new ballgame. I don't know if there have been reports like that in the past, and I don't know if they've gone anywhere. I don't know what's been, I don't know anything about this, but until now, China is basically, they signed this no limits partnership with Russia a few weeks before the war. Russia clearly seems to have misinformed China about what they were going to do, and China felt very set up by having signed this big document, which put them solidly in the Russian camp right before Russia launched this massive invasion. And they clearly weren't straight with China about the scale of what they were planning. And they also, China probably thought that whatever Russia did, it would win, and it didn't. And that must have been very annoying to China. So it put China in a very awkward position. It put Xi Jinping in an incredibly awkward position because he had made a huge deal out of his personal relationship with Putin. It's very, Putin was his big cool friend. This bromance. They put this on TV in China. Putin would come to China and they would eat dumplings and eat caviar and go to hockey games and ride on bullet trains together and stuff like that. It was, and suddenly, Xi's looks like he's been left holding the bag. He looks like he was set up by Putin. So China, basically all the support they gave to Russia was they kind of watered down UN Security Council resolutions and kind of gave them diplomatic support, but they didn't put any of their companies in harm's way. They didn't take any risks. No Chinese companies have, some kind of Chinese companies have violated US sanctions by accident, I imagine, but not as any part of coordinated effort to help Russia. But the relationship is growing and it's actually becoming, Russia's become quite dependent on it. Trade turnover between Russia and China has grown by over 1/3 last year, which means, China is clearly, they may be supporting the letter of Western sanctions against Russia, but they're not supporting the spirit if their trade turnover is growing to that extent. I do think China wants Russia to win, and in Ukraine, I don't think they have anything against Ukraine, but they see everything through the prism of a confrontation with the United States, and they see anything that ties the US down in a European war where the US is spending $60 to $70 billion a year, roughly the same that they were spending in Afghanistan. That's a very kind of unfortunately very useful thing for China to do. And so I don't think I don't think there's any incentive for China to really play a constructive role in Ukraine. But I don't see a kind of grand ideological meeting of minds the way you saw in the 50s between when the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China had this iron brotherhood of Xi and of Mao and Stalin. That's totally lacking, and it's probably more of a marriage of convenience rather than a NATO-like ideological alliance. I don't know if that helps or not, but I should probably stop here for the interest of time.
Thank you, Charles. We've got time for 3 questions. I've got 3 fantastic questions that I want to put to the panel. So panel, choose which one you want to answer, but please let's make sure we answer each of them because they're all good. The first one is from Gabor Seprenyi from GR Japan, and Gabor says, what will be the focus in the field of energy of Japan's G7 presidency, energy security or green transformation, climate change, or a balance between the two? That was the first question. The second question comes from Sato Taketsugu from the Asahi. Sato-san says, as Dr. Smith touched on the nuclear issue, Prime Minister Kishida has said that Japan needs to strengthen extended deterrence with the US. At the same time, he has emphasized that he would pursue a non-nuclear world as a state having suffered atomic bombings in the Second World War. However, the current security environment on nuclear weapons such as DPRK, Russia and China is deteriorating. So what kind of message do you expect to come out of the G7 summit on the nuclear issue? And do you think Prime Minister Kishida can pave the way for a non-nuclear world? And the third question of a number of questions, so apologies to those that I didn't get to, from Lars Brothers at SWP Berlin in Germany. The legitimacy of the G7 rests on effective policy making, but also on encouraging participation by non-state actors such as engagement groups representing business, science and civil society. Last year, the German G7 presidency supported outreach of the engagement groups to the global south and to their counterparts in Ukraine to show solidarity. Will Japan continue this support? So, panel, we have about 5 minutes to answer all these enormous questions. So if you could be very, very crisp, but take your pick. And Shikata-san, I can see you champing at the bit already for a couple of answers there. So over to you first, please.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I will briefly touch on 3 questions. Number 1, on climate and energy. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has reaffirmed the importance of ensuring energy security. At the same time, the goal of 2050 net zero remains unchanged, and it is necessary for us to present a path for a robust energy transition that is tailored to the circumstances of respective countries and regions. And at the same time, given the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we are reminded of the importance to promote diversification of energy sources and reduce energy reliance on Russia. So Prime Minister Kishida is trying to make use of all the energy sources, including civil nuclear power plants, next generation nuclear power, hydrogen, ammonia, not to speak of promoting renewable energy. So Japan's energy landscape is very tight and challenging, but Japan is also trying to support Asia's energy transition in the context of Asia Energy Transition Initiative, focusing on ASEAN and India. Number 2, on nuclear issues, Prime Minister Kishida has been advocating this Hiroshima Action Plan, and he has been emphasizing the importance of continuing the record of no use of nuclear weapons, enhancing transparency, and maintaining the decreasing trend of the global nuclear stockpiles. It's not easy, but we need to remind the international community that these are the issues that we need to tackle in addition to securing nuclear non-proliferation. And Prime Minister Kishida is encouraging visits to Hiroshima and Nagasaki by international leaders and young people. And on last questions about engaging with various communities, we will be having various gatherings of civil societies in Japan in the context of G7. And of course, as we are aware, this year there will be a Quad Summit to be held in Australia. And India will be hosting G20, APEC to be hosted in the United States, and we'll be having a special leaders meeting between Japan and ASEAN at the end of the year. So for us, this is a G7 year, but at the same time, we will be continuing our efforts to engage with various communities and as we discuss the Global South members. Thank you.
Thank you, Shikata-san. Sheila, you were nodding there with on the nuclear issue, I think.
Well, very briefly, since I think the question Sato-san posed about what is the tension between extended deterrence in the U.S.-Japan alliance and the aspirations and the advocacy for a non-nuclear world, that's a tension that's always been Japan's to carry. I think the question really is about making sure that the Japanese people are safe in the world in which they live and confront in the moment. And that is where the extended deterrence question is really important. And as Sato-san pointed out, the nuclear threat to Japan, potential nuclear threat to Japan, comes not just from the Russians up north, but from the Chinese, and the DPRK, of course, as we noted, has been very active. So I think the extended deterrence conversation will be very important for the U.S.-Japan alliance. If you move over to the U.S.-ROK alliance, you can see that the nuclear question is very vibrant in South Korean politics these days. It is not so in Japan, but I think there's a realism that will underpin the alliance conversation with Washington, as well as the longer term question about Japan's own choices going forward. So I don't see a contradiction, but I think a mutual balancing here is really what the Japanese government seems to be pursuing.
Thank you. Saori and Charles, did you have any further points?
Just one brief bit about the energy and green GX, the green transformation. I think this is yes, it's a very difficult time with the energy challenge, insecurity and so on, but this is an opportune time too. So in some ways, Japan's effort in green transformation at the time when the energy insecurity is really severe is a kind of a good, I don't know, opportune combination where people can make much more emphasis on that transformation.
Thank you. And Charles, any final comments?
Nothing, nothing really on energy transformation. I mean, I think the question of Japan's participation in Sakhalin will have to kind of come up at some point, and this is going to be very difficult. But yes, I mean, energy transformation is definitely one of the most important things that has to happen throughout the whole world, actually. But I'll leave it there. I think we're out of time.
Good point to mention Sakhalin, though. That was important to raise that. Well, we are out of time, unfortunately, and we are only 3 minutes over time, so nearly got on finish when we wanted to. But please, everybody on the line, please thank Shikata-san, Saori, Charles, and Sheila for a really informative and engaging discussion. Mariko and I have certainly got a lot out of this discussion, so I hope you have as well. We will have a recording of the webinar will be made available by our fantastic IISS technical team within the next 24 hours, so you can get that on IISS.org. And we hope to see you again soon on the next IISS Japan Chair webinar. So many thanks everybody for joining. Thank you.